Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the veins of gold run almost as deep as the veins of corruption. Tonight's story isn't about a lone gunslinger or a desperate outlaw. It's about a young woman who was meant to be a pawn in a rich man's game, and the lawmen who sired her. They thought they could break the father by caging the daughter. They soon learned that when you corner a lioness, you don't just have to worry about her claws, you have to worry about the old lion who taught her how to hunt. Gather round, folks, for the story of Annabel Carter and the reckoning at Red Hollow, a tale we call The Sheriff's Daughter. Red Hollow was a town born from a fever, gold fever. It clung to the steep slopes of the San Juan Mountains like a stubborn prospector, a chaotic jumble of raw lumber buildings, muddy streets, and the ever-present, thundering heartbeat of the ore crushers at the Goliath mine. The air itself tasted metallic, a fine, gritty dust that settled on everything and served as a constant reminder of the town's single purpose, to tear wealth from the belly of the earth. In a place like this, greed was the official religion, and the law was often just the highest bidder. Except, in Red Hollow, the law was not for sale. The law was Sheriff Eli Carter. Eli was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains that surrounded him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a roadmap of hard-won lines, his mustache thick and gray. He had been a lawman for 30 years, and his belief in justice was as solid and unyielding as a vein of pure silver. He was scrupulously, stubbornly honest, a fact that made him a beacon of stability for the town's decent folk and a monumental frustration to its predators. He wore his tin star not as a symbol of power, but as a mark of a sacred duty. But Sheriff Carter's greatest pride, and his greatest vulnerability, was not his office. It was his daughter, Annabel. At 19, Annabel Carter was the living embodiment of the West's intamable spirit. She had her mother's fiery red hair, a cascade of unruly curls she usually kept tied back in a practical braid, and her father's clear, steady gray eyes, which missed nothing and feared little. She was no delicate, hothouse flower. She had grown up in the shadow of the sheriff's office, and her education had been as much about tracking and shooting as it was about reading and arithmetic. She could ride a horse like she was born in the saddle, handle a Winchester with a calm competence that unnerved most men, and she possessed a mind as sharp as a newly honed skinning knife. She was the heart of Red Hollow. The townspeople adored her. They saw in her the best of her father's integrity, softened by a warmth and compassion that was all her own. She would help the blacksmith's wife with a difficult birth, teach the miner's children to read on a Sunday afternoon, and face down a belligerent drunk in the street with a quiet authority that was often more effective than her father's drawn pistol. She moved through the rough, male-dominated world of the mining town with an unshakable confidence, demanding respect not with aggression, but with a simple, unwavering sense of her own worth. She was her father's daughter, through, and for that, she was both loved and, in certain circles, deeply resented. The most powerful of those circles was the one that gathered around Grady Voss, the owner of the Goliath mine. Voss was a new breed of predator, a man who had come from the east with deep pockets and an even deeper well of ambition. He was handsome, impeccably dressed, and possessed a smile as smooth and cold as polished marble. He didn't see Red Hollow as a community, he saw it as an asset on a ledger, a resource to be exploited until it was sucked dry. Voss was in the business of empire building. He was systematically buying up the smaller, independent claims around Red Hollow, using a combination of predatory loans and outright intimidation. His ultimate goal was to own the entire valley, to control the water, the land, and the gold beneath it, turning the free-spirited town into a company-owned fiefdom. He had already installed a puppet, a weak-willed merchant named Silas Croft, as the deputy mayor, and his payroll included a gang of hired guns, led by a ruthless enforcer named Finn, who acted as his mine guards. The only thing standing in his way was Sheriff Eli Carter. The conflict between the two men was a slow-burning fuse. Voss had tried all the usual methods. He had offered bribes, thinly veiled as contributions to the town's welfare. Eli had refused them. He had hinted at a lucrative partnership, the chance for the sheriff to get in on the ground floor of the valley's bright, prosperous future. Eli had shown him the door. He had tried to use his political influence, complaining to the territorial governor about Carter's anti-business practices. But Eli's reputation for honesty was legendary, and the complaints had gone nowhere. Eli Carter was an immovable object, a rock against which Voss's waves of corruption and influence broke and receded. He enforced the law equally, whether it was a case of a drunken miner stealing a chicken or Voss's men illegally damming a creek to divert water to the Goliath mine. For Voss, a man accustomed to buying whatever and whomever he wanted, this stubborn, incorruptible lawman was more than an obstacle. He was an insult. The tension came to a head over the O'Connell claim. Old Man O'Connell, a grizzled prospector with a claim on a small but vital piece of land right next to the Goliath, had refused to sell to Voss. A week later, he was found dead at the bottom of a ravine, his mule tracks mysteriously leading to the edge. Voss's bought and paid for coroner ruled it an accident. Everyone in town knew it was murder, but no one dared to say so, except Sheriff Carter. He opened an official investigation, methodically interviewing Voss's men, poking holes in their alibis, making it clear that he would not let the matter drop. He was a bulldog who had sunk his teeth into the truth, and he would not let go. It was this investigation that sealed Annabel's fate. Voss, sitting in his opulent mansion that overlooked the sprawling, noisy mine, convened a meeting with his key lieutenants, the sniveling Deputy Mayor Croft and the thuggish enforcer, Finn. "Carter is becoming a problem," Voss said, swirling a glass of brandy. His voice was calm, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "His investigation is a nuisance. He's turning public opinion against us. We need to silence him. We could arrange an accident for the sheriff, too," Finn growled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "No," Voss said, a flicker of annoyance on his face. "You're a blunt instrument, Finn. Killing a popular sheriff would turn this town into a hornet's nest. It would bring in territorial marshals, investigators, a mess we don't need. We can't attack him directly." He took a slow sip of his brandy, a cold, calculating smile spreading across his face. "But a man like Carter, a man who prides himself on his honor, his duty, he has a weakness, a pressure point. We cannot break the lawman. So, we will break the man. We will take his heart." Deputy Mayor Croft, a man whose spine was made of jelly, shifted nervously. "His heart? What do you mean?" Voss looked from one man to the other, his smile widening. "I mean, gentlemen, that it's time someone taught the sheriff's beautiful, defiant daughter a lesson in economics. After all, in a town like Red Hollow, everything and everyone is a price." He began to lay out his plan, his voice a low, venomous whisper. It was a plan of such cynical, political cruelty that even the thuggish Finn felt a momentary chill. It was a plan that would use the very laws Eli Carter had sworn to uphold to destroy him, to defile the one thing in the world he held sacred. The fuse that had been burning between the two men was about to reach the powder keg, and the explosion would not just shake the town of Red Hollow, it would threaten to shatter the soul of the Carter family forever. The trap was sprung not with the roar of a gunshot, but with the quiet scratching of a pen on paper. Grady Voss's brand of evil was insidious. It wrapped itself in the robes of legitimacy, using the law as a garrote to strangle the very justice it was meant to protect. His plan to break Sheriff Carter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty, and its architect was the sniveling deputy mayor, Silas Croft. The plot began with a manufactured debt. Croft, in his capacity as both deputy mayor and the owner of the town's largest mercantile, produced a series of falsified ledgers and forged promissory notes. These documents purported to show that Sheriff Carter had, over the past year, accrued a massive and paid debt for town supplies, everything from ammunition for his office to feed for the jail's single horse. The figures were wildly inflated, a work of pure fiction, but they were presented with an official town seal, giving them the veneer of authenticity. The next step was a secret, late-night town council meeting. The council consisted of Croft and two other local merchants who were deeply in Voss's pocket. In this sham session, they officially certified the fraudulent debt. Then, citing an obscure territorial ordinance that allowed for the garnishment of property to settle official municipal debts, they passed a new, malicious resolution. The ordinance stated that if a public official could not settle a debt with cash or property, the debt could be satisfied through the contracted labor of an immediate family member. It was a vile, archaic piece of legal maneuvering, likely intended for a bygone era, but Croft, at Voss's direction, had resurrected it for his own nefarious purpose. The final piece of the puzzle was the contract. Grady Voss, in a display of supposed civic generosity, offered to purchase this labor contract from the town. thereby clearing the sheriff's debt. The contract stipulated that the Labornabel Carter would work at the Goliath mine for a period of 1 year to satisfy the obligation. On paper, it looked like a standard, if severe, indenture agreement. But everyone involved in the conspiracy knew its true, monstrous intent. The morning after the secret meeting, Sheriff Carter was served with the official papers. He was in his office, cleaning his shotgun, when Croft and 2 of Voss's hired guns entered. Croft, unable to meet the sheriff's gaze, slid the documents across the desk. Eli read them, his face impassive at first, his mind struggling to comprehend the sheer, audacious villainy of the scheme. He read them a second time, and a slow, cold fury began to build behind his gray eyes. It wasn't the fake debt that angered him, it was the name on the labor contract. Annabelle. What is this, Silas? Allie's voice was dangerously calm. It's the law, Sheriff, Croft stammered, shrinking back. The council has voted. The debt is legal. Mr. Voss has generously offered to resolve the situation. Get out, Eli said, his voice a low growl. Now, Sheriff, you can. I said, get out, Eli roared, sweeping the papers from his desk. He stood up, his full height seeming to fill the small office, his hand resting on the shotgun. Get out of my office before I forget what this star on my chest stands for. Croft and his men practically fell over each other in their haste to leave. Eli stood there for a long time, the silence of the office pressing in on him. He was trapped. He knew the documents were a farce, a complete fabrication. But they were official. They had been signed and sealed by the acting town government. To the outside world, to the distant and impartial territorial marshals, it would look like a legitimate civil matter. If he reacted with violence, if he drew his gun and arrested Croft and went after Voss, he would be the one seen as the lawbreaker. They would call it an abuse of power, an act of a desperate man trying to evade his debts. They would have the legal high ground. And in the meantime, what would happen to Annabelle? They held her life, her safety, in their hands. They had him in a perfect, diabolical checkmate. Annabelle was at the general store when Finn and 2 other mine guards came for her. She had been arranging a delivery of supplies for a widow on the edge of town, her laughter echoing in the dusty aisles. There was no violence. Finn, Voss's enforcer, was smugly polite. He simply showed her the contract, the official town seal gleaming on the paper. Miss Carter, he said, a cruel smirk on his lips. It seems your services are required up at the Goliath. By order of the town council. The storekeeper and the few customers present looked on in horrified silence. Annabelle read the document, her face paling as she understood the monstrous implication. This wasn't an arrest. It was a transaction. She was being sold. She looked into Finn's cold, dead eyes and saw the triumph there. She looked at the faces of her friends and neighbors and saw their fear, their helplessness. And in that moment, she knew that to scream, to fight, because the scene here would only give them the satisfaction they craved. It would only make her look hysterical, guilty. She straightened her shoulders, her chin held high, the fire returning to her eyes. Let me get my things, she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the terror and rage that was churning inside her. No need for that, Finn said with a chuckle. Mr. Voss has made sure you'll have everything you need. They walked her out into the street. It was a public shaming, a deliberate spectacle. The whole town watched from behind their curtains as the sheriff's daughter was led away, not in chains, but by the invisible shackles of a corrupt law. She did not look down. She met the gaze of every person she passed, her expression a mixture of defiance and a silent plea not to be forgotten. When they reached the edge of town, they didn't take the main road to the Goliath. They took a side trail that led to Voss's private mansion, a large, ostentatious house built on a hill overlooking the mine and the town, like a vulture's nest. Grady Voss was waiting for her on the veranda, dressed in a silk smoking jacket, a glass of brandy in his hand. He dismissed Finn with a flick of his wrist. Annabelle, he said, his voice smooth and proprietary. Welcome. I trust your journey was not too unpleasant. What do you want, Voss? She asked, her voice cold as ice. I want what your father was unwilling to provide, he said, taking a step closer. Cooperation. I want him to understand the new realities of Red Hollow. I want him to understand that I am a man who gets what he wants. He smiled, a predatory, reptilian expression. And right now, my dear, what I want is you. You are the price of his honesty. I trust you will be an accommodating employee. The meaning was unmistakable, vile, and terrifying. She was not to be a miner or a clerk. She was to be his personal property, a slave in his gilded cage, a living, breathing symbol of his victory over her father. The contract was a lie. This was a kidnapping, a sexual assault sanctioned by a corrupt government. Annabel looked at him, at his handsome, smiling face, and she felt a wave of nausea. But beneath the fear, the core of iron that was her heritage began to glow. He thought he had won. He thought she was a frightened girl, a pawn to be used and discarded. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He hadn't just purchased a laborer. He had just locked himself in a cage with a lioness. And she would spend every waking moment looking for a way to tear him to pieces. The mansion was a prison of cruel, mocking luxury. While the miners lived in squalid, cramped bunkhouses, Grady Voss had built himself a palace of dark wood, plush carpets, and crystal chandeliers. It was a monument to his greed, filled with expensive furniture, fine wines, and the stifled silence of a place ruled by fear. Annabel was given a small but well-appointed room in the servants' quarters, its only window barred with decorative ironwork. She was a prisoner, and the opulence was just another part of her cage. Voss was a patient, sadistic tormentor. He did not assault her physically, not at first. His cruelty was more refined. He enjoyed the psychological game, the slow, deliberate stripping away of her identity. He forced her to serve him his meals, to stand silently in the corner of his study while he conducted his business, to act as his personal maid. Each command was designed to humiliate, to remind her of her new status as his possession. "Pour me more wine, Annabel," he would say, his voice dripping with condescension. "And try not to spill it. Good help is so hard to find." The staff, a small group of terrified men and women, were too frightened to even meet her eyes. They were prisoners too, trapped by circumstance and their fear of Voss. They saw her as a dangerous complication, another source of the master's unpredictable wrath. But Annabel did not break. She did not cry. She did not plead. She performed the tasks he set for her with a cold, robotic efficiency, her face an unreadable mask. Her compliance was a form of defiance. She refused to give him the satisfaction of her tears, the pleasure of her fear. Inside, however, a fire of pure, cold hatred was being stoked. She was not just surviving, she was observing. She was learning. Her mind, sharp and analytical, became her weapon. She memorized the layout of the mansion, the location of every door and window. She noted the guards' patrol schedules, the precise times they changed shifts. She paid attention during Voss's business meetings, listening to his plans, learning the names of his co-conspirators, understanding the full scope of his corrupt enterprise. Her servitude was a disguise for espionage. Voss, blinded by his own arrogance, mistook her silence for submission. He saw her as a broken, defeated girl. He had no idea that behind her calm, gray eyes, a brilliant, strategic mind was plotting his downfall. She knew she couldn't escape on her own. The mansion was too well guarded, the surrounding terrain too rugged. She needed allies. She began to subtly cultivate them, starting with the most overlooked and oppressed people in Voss's empire, the miners. Her opportunity came when Voss, in a fit of pique, assigned her to a week of real labor, sending her to work in the mine's kitchens, a hot, grimy hellhole where the miners' meager rations were prepared. It was meant to be another humiliation, a way to break her spirit by covering her in grease and grime. Instead, it was a gift. Here, away from the direct keys of Voss, she could finally talk to people. She listened to the miners' stories of brutal working conditions, of wages stolen through company scrip, of men who had been injured and left to die without a doctor's care. She saw their simmering resentment, their desperate, hopeless anger, and she began to nurture it. She started with small acts of kindness. She would slip an extra piece of bread to a young miner who looked half-starved. She would offer a word of comfort to an old man whose cough was getting worse. They were small gestures, but in a place devoid of human kindness, they were powerful. They began to trust her. They saw in her not just the sheriff's daughter, but a fellow prisoner, someone who understood their plight. Her most important ally was a young boy named Sam, a weary, quick-witted orphan of about 12 who worked as a delivery boy, running messages and supplies between the mine and the town. He was practically invisible to the guards, just another piece of the mine's machinery. Sam revered Sheriff Carter and adored Annabelle, and he was heartbroken and furious about what had happened to her. Annabelle found him one afternoon behind the kitchens, trying to fix a broken strap on his delivery pouch. "That looks tricky," she said, her voice low. Sam looked up, his eyes wide. "Miss Annabelle, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Sam," she said, kneeling beside him. "But I need your help. I need to get a message to my father." The boy's eyes lit up with a fierce loyalty. "Anything," he whispered. "They can't do this to you. It ain't right." "I know," she said. "Now listen carefully. This is very important. No one can know." Under the guise of mending his pouch, she began to pass him information. It started with small, coded messages, written on scraps of paper and hidden in the pouch's lining. She told her father she was unharmed, but a prisoner. She told him not to act rashly, that she was working on a plan. As the days turned into weeks, the messages became more detailed. She drew maps of the mansion from memory. She provided the names of the guards and their shift changes. She detailed the location of the mine's armory, where Voss kept a cache of rifles and dynamite. She told him of the growing unrest among the miners, of the allies she was making. She was not just a captive waiting for rescue. She was the architect of her own liberation, a general gathering intelligence from behind enemy lines. Sam became her lifeline, a brave and clever courier who risked a terrible punishment if he were ever caught. He would deliver supplies to the mansion and, with a subtle nod or a prearranged signal, let her know that a message had been safely passed to her father. Inside the mansion, Annabelle's defiance grew bolder. She began to subtly undermine Voss's authority. She would accidentally spill a drink on an important document. She would misplace the key to the wine cellar just before he was meant to entertain an important guest. They were small acts of sabotage, designed to frustrate him, to throw his perfectly ordered world into chaos. Voss, enraged by her continued insolence, finally lost his patience. He grabbed her one evening in his study, his fingers biting into her arm, his face a mask of fury. "You think this is a game?" he snarled, his handsome face ugly with rage. "You think you can defy me? I own you, you stubborn little bitch. And it's time I collected on my investment." The moment she had been dreading was here. But she was not the same girl who had been brought to the mansion weeks ago. She was a soldier. As he dragged her toward his chambers, she did not scream. She simply looked at him, her eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "You will live to regret this, Mr. Voss," she said, her voice a low, chilling promise. "I guarantee it." He laughed at her threat, but had he been a wiser man, he would have seen the look in her eyes not as the defiance of a victim, but as the deadly certainty of an executioner. The caged lioness was done waiting. It was time to roar. The messages from Annabelle were both a torment and a lifeline for Sheriff Eli Carter. Each smuggled note, delivered by the brave young Sam, brought the agonizing relief of knowing his daughter was alive, but also a fresh wave of fury at the descriptions of her captivity. He read her maps, memorized her intelligence, and marveled at the strength and cunning of the daughter he had raised. She was not asking for rescue. She was providing him with a battle plan. Eli was a man on fire, but it was a cold, controlled burn. He had to fight every instinct in his body that screamed for him to take his shotgun, ride up to Voss's mansion, and dispense his own brutal, immediate justice. Annabelle's warnings were clear. A rash move would get her killed and accomplish nothing. He had to be patient. He had to be strategic. He had to become the general his daughter needed him to be. The town of Red Hollow was a powder keg of resentment, but the people were too scared to act. Eli knew he couldn't rely on a general uprising. He needed a corps of fighters, men he could trust, men who weren't afraid of Grady Voss's hired guns. His mind turned to his past, to the days before he had pinned on a star, when he had ridden with a different kind of man. He sent out riders with cryptic messages, calling in old debts. The first to answer was Grizzly Jim Hatcher, a mountain of a man who now worked as a fur trapper in the high country. Grizzly had been Ellie's deputy years ago, before settling down. He owed Eli his life from a long-ago shootout, and when he heard that Ellie's daughter was in trouble, he came down from the mountains with his long rifle and a grim look in his eyes. The next to arrive were the Taggart brothers, Clay and Jesse, a pair of bounty hunters Eli had once arrested and then, seeing a spark of decency in them, had helped get pardoned. They were rough men, cynical and deadly, but they operated by their own strange code of honor, and their debt to Eli was a part of that code. They rode into Red Hollow one evening, their dusters long, their eyes sharp, bringing with them the unmistakable aura of professional violence. With Grizzly and the Taggarts as his lieutenants, Eli began to quietly recruit. He didn't look for the loudest talkers in the saloon. He went to the quiet men, the hard-working miners and ranchers who had been personally wronged by Voss. He spoke to a Welsh miner whose brother had been killed in a preventable mine collapse. He visited a homesteader whose land had been stolen through one of Voss's fraudulent contracts. He didn't offer them money. He offered them something far more powerful, a chance at justice. His army was small, a motley collection of about 15 men. A few bounty hunters, a mountain man, and a dozen grim-faced miners armed with pickaxes and a burning hatred for their oppressor. They gathered at a secret camp in the hills outside of town, training under the watchful eyes of the Taggarts, learning to move and fight as a unit. Ellie's meetings with Sam became the nerve center of the operation. The boy would slip out of town and meet the sheriff at a prearranged location, delivering Annabelle's latest intelligence and carrying back new instructions. The final piece of the plan came in a note scrawled on a piece of burlap: dynamite. West Tunnel, Shaft 4. And stable. Finn keeps the keys. He visits the saloon every Thursday. Likes the redhead. It was the key they needed. The plan was set. They would strike at dawn on Friday, when the night shift was exhausted and the morning shift was not yet fully alert. The Taggart brothers would deal with Finn at the saloon on Thursday night and acquire the keys to the armory and the dynamite storage. At the same time, Annabelle would initiate her part of the plan from within. The night before the raid, Eli gathered his small army around a campfire. The mood was tense, the faces illuminated by the flickering flames filled with a mixture of fear and grim determination. "I won't lie to you," Eli said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the chirping of the crickets. "Tomorrow, some of us might not see the sunset. Voss has more men, and they are well armed. But we have something he doesn't. We have the truth on our side. We're fighting for our homes, for our families, and for the soul of this town. We are fighting for my daughter." He looked around at the faces of the men who had put their trust in him. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know this: you have the gratitude of an old lawman and the respect of a father. Now get some rest. We ride before dawn." As the camp settled into a tense silence, Eli stood alone, looking out at the distant, malevolent glow of the Goliath mine. He cleaned his shotgun and his peacemaker, his movements methodical and practiced. He was no longer just a sheriff. He was a commander, a father leading his men into battle to save his child. He felt a profound, terrible clarity. The law he had served his entire life had been twisted and used as a weapon against him. Tomorrow, he would answer not with the law of the books, but with the older, more primal law of the gun. The fury of a father, long held in check, was about to be unleashed upon Red Hollow, and it would wash the town clean in a tide of fire and blood. Thursday night in Red Hollow was a study in contrasts. In the hills, Eli Carter's small band of rebels sat in quiet, tense anticipation, cleaning weapons and murmuring last-minute plans. In the town, at the Gilded Cage Saloon, it was business as usual. The tinny sound of a piano mingled with raucous laughter and the clink of glasses, a facade of normalcy that belied the storm about to break. Finn, Grady Voss's chief enforcer, was at his usual corner table, a bottle of cheap whiskey and a buxom, red-headed saloon girl his only companions. He was arrogant and complacent, secure in the belief that the town had been thoroughly cowed. He didn't notice the two quiet strangers who had taken a table near the door, their dusters still on, their hats pulled low. Clay and Jesse Taggart were professionals, and they faded into the background as easily as a coyote melts into the twilight. They waited. They watched as Finn drank, his movements growing sloppier, his laughter louder. They waited until the redhead, her shift over, collected her pay and left through the back door. They waited another 10 minutes, letting Finn stew in his drunken solitude. Then, as one, they stood up and moved. Clay Taggart approached the table from the front, a lazy, disarming smile on his face. "Evening, friend. Mind if we join you? The rest of this place is a little too crowded for our taste." Finn looked up, his eyes bleary and suspicious. "Get lost. I ain't in the mood for company." "That's a shame," Clay said, his smile never wavering. Because you're exactly the company we're in the mood for. At that moment, Jesse Taggart, who had circled around the back of the saloon, came through the rear entrance, a dark shape blocking the alley light. The few remaining patrons saw the grim look on his face and the way his hand hovered near his gun, and they suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. The saloon emptied in a matter of seconds, leaving only the three men and the nervous bartender. Finn, his drunken mind finally registering the danger, tried to stand, his hand clawing for his pistol. He was too slow. Clay's hand shot out, not for his gun, but for the whiskey bottle on the table. He brought it down in a vicious arc, shattering it against the side of Finn's head. The enforcer grunted and collapsed back into his chair, stunned and bleeding. Before he could recover, Jesse was on him, pressing the cold muzzle of a Colt against his temple. "The keys," Jesse said, his voice a low growl. "The ones for the mine armory and the dynamite locker. Give them to me, or the last thing you'll ever hear is this hammer falling." Under the undeniable persuasion of the Colt, Finn's bravado evaporated. Trembling, he unhooked a heavy ring of keys from his belt and tossed them onto the table. "Now what?" Finn stammered, blood trickling into his eyes. Clay picked up the keys. "Now," he said, his smile gone, replaced by a look of cold purpose, "you're going to take a nice long nap." He brought the barrel of his pistol down hard on the back of Finn's head. The enforcer went limp, slumping onto the table in a drunken, unconscious heap. The keys were theirs. The first phase was complete. Meanwhile, up at the mansion, Annabelle was preparing for her own part in the coming battle. Her final, desperate message to her father had been sent that afternoon via Sam Knight. "Boss is planning to force the issue. I cannot wait any longer. Whatever you are planning, it must be tomorrow at dawn. I will create a diversion from inside." The diversion was a plan of audacious, suicidal bravery. After she was certain Voss was asleep, his snores a low rumble from the master bedroom, she slipped from her small room. She moved through the silent, moonlit hallways of her prison like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound on the plush carpets. She had a single goal, the kitchen. There, she worked quickly and silently. She gathered a dozen large tins of lard and cooking oil. She took every candle and oil lamp she could find. She was building a collection of incendiary devices, preparing to turn her gilded cage into a beacon of rebellion. Her final and most crucial preparation was in the mansion's small stable, where Voss kept his prized thoroughbreds. The stable was guarded by a single, sleepy man. Annabelle, hiding in the shadows of the hayloft, waited for the perfect moment. When the guard turned his back to check on a horse, she dropped down behind him, a heavy iron skillet appropriate from the kitchen in her hand. She brought it down with all her strength against the back of his head. The man grunted and collapsed without a sound. She didn't kill him, but she had neutralized the threat. Now the way was clear. She worked feverishly, opening the stall doors, slapping the rumps of the expensive, high-strung horses, driving them out into the night. The panicked animals, wild-eyed and whinnying, galloped down the hill toward the main mine complex, a chaotic, thundering stampede that would be the first sign to the outside world that something was wrong within Voss's fortress. With the horses freed, she turned her attention to the small tack room. It was here that Voss kept a private stock of expensive saddles, bridles, and a locked case containing a pair of pearl-handled Remington revolvers and several boxes of ammunition. The lock was no match for the crowbar she had found in the stable. With a sharp crack of splintering wood, the case was open. She strapped on the gun belt, the weight of the pistols on her hips feeling both strange and deeply, profoundly familiar. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a maid. She was Sheriff Eli Carter's daughter, and she was armed. As the first, faint hint of gray began to touch the eastern sky, she returned to the mansion. She began to set her fires, placing the oil can large soaked rags at the base of curtains and against wooden furniture. It was a terrible act, destroying the beautiful, hateful house, but it was a necessary one. The fire would be her signal to her father. It would be the beacon that would guide his army of vengeance. And it would be the first spark in the firestorm that was about to consume Grady Voss and his empire. Annabelle stood for a moment, a pistol in each hand, the smell of coal oil thick in the air. She was terrified, but she was also filled with a fierce, righteous clarity. The rebellion had begun. The world caught fire at 5:15 a.m. Annabelle lit the first rag in Voss's opulent study, the flames instantly consuming a stack of fraudulent contracts on his desk. She moved through the downstairs rooms with a grim purpose, leaving a trail of burgeoning fires in her wake. The blaze took hold with a terrifying speed, the dry wood and rich fabrics a perfect fuel. Within minutes, the lower floor of the mansion was a raging inferno, thick, black smoke billowing from the windows. The alarm was raised not by a shout, but by the terrified screams of the awakening household staff. Grady Voss burst from his bedroom, his silk robe flapping, his face a mask of rage and disbelief as he saw his empire of luxury being consumed by flames. This was the diversion Annabelle needed. In the chaos and panic, as guards and servants ran frantically, she slipped out the back entrance and ran, not away from the mine, but directly towards it. She was a lone, armed figure, silhouetted against the light of the burning mansion, and she was heading for the heart of the enemy's camp. Down in the valley, Eli Carter saw the signal. The orange glow on the hilltop was a beautiful, terrifying sight. "That's her," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "That's my girl." He turned to his small army. "It's time. Let's go bring her home." They moved out, a silent, grim procession in the pre-dawn gloom. The plan was a three-pronged assault. The Taggart brothers, with the stolen keys, would lead a small team of miners to the armory to secure the main cache of weapons. Grizzly Jim, the mountain man, would take another team to create a diversion at the main mine entrance, drawing the bulk of the guards' attention. And Eli, with the remainder of the men, would lead the main assault force through a series of abandoned, forgotten mining tunnels that Annabelle had marked on her maps. A route that would bring them up right into the center of the miners' bunkhouse area. The battle for Red Hollow began with a single, massive explosion. The Taggart brothers, having armed their team, used a stick of dynamite to blow the door off the main guardhouse, sowing chaos and confusion among the sleepy, unprepared men inside. The sound of the blast, echoing across the valley, was the starting gun for the war. From the main mine entrance, Grizzly Jim and his men opened fire, their rifles cracking in the half-light. The mine guards, thinking this was the main attack, rushed to the entrance, taking cover behind ore carts and timber stacks, returning fire. And it was at that moment that Eli Carter and his men emerged from the mouth of the old tunnel, right in the heart of the enemy's camp. They swarmed into the bunkhouse area, their shotguns and rifles roaring. The miners, awakened by the explosions and the gunfire, saw what was happening. They saw the sheriff, their champion, leading a charge. They saw their fellow workers armed and fighting back. And the simmering resentment that Annabelle had so carefully nurtured erupted into a full-scale rebellion. They poured from the bunkhouses, a wave of enraged, oppressed men. They were armed not with guns, but with the tools of their trade, pickaxes, sledgehammers, and iron bars. They were a raw, brutal, and unstoppable force, their battle cry the pent-up rage of years of abuse. The mine complex, which had been a place of orderly, grinding oppression, descended into a maelstrom of chaotic, brutal warfare. The air was filled with the roar of guns, the splintering of wood, the clang of iron on iron, and the screams of the wounded. In the midst of this chaos, two figures fought with a skill and a fury that set them apart. Eli Carter moved through the battle like the veteran lawman he was, his shotgun a tool of grim, efficient justice. He was not a wild attacker, he was calm, methodical, his shots always finding their mark, his presence a steadying rock for the men fighting alongside him. And then there was Annabelle. She had reached the bunkhouse area just as her father's forces emerged. For a heart-stopping moment, father and daughter locked eyes across the battlefield, a silent acknowledgement of their shared purpose passing between them. Then they were in it, fighting side by side. Annabelle was a revelation. She was not a brawling miner, she was a shooter, a tactician. She used cover, she moved with a fluid grace, and the twin Remingtons in her hands spoke with a deadly, practiced authority. She fought with a cold, controlled rage, the memory of her humiliation fueling every shot. She saw the faces of the guards who had mocked her, the men who had stood by and watched as Voss had tried to break her, and she dispensed a terrible, precise justice. The tide of the battle turned decisively. The mine guards, caught between Grizzly's forces at the entrance, there were miners from the armory, and the main rebellion in the center, broke. Their will to fight for a paycheck was no match for the righteous fury of men fighting for their lives and their freedom. They threw down their weapons. They fled into the hills. They surrendered. As the sun finally broke over the mountain peaks, its light illuminating a scene of smoke, fire, and carnage, a strange quiet began to fall over the battlefield. The fighting was dying down. The rebellion had won. But the war was not over. Grady Voss, who had escaped the burning mansion, was still at large. And he was cornered, desperate, and watching the battle from his last remaining bastion of power, the main ore processing plant, a towering, multi-level wooden structure that sat at the heart of the mine. He was a snake in his nest, and Eli and Annabelle knew that the fight would not be over until the snake's head was cut off. Together, father and daughter, their faces smudged with gunpowder, their eyes burning with a shared purpose, turned toward the final confrontation. The ore processing plant was a fortress of timber and iron, a multi-story labyrinth of catwalks, crushers, and conveyor belts that rose from the heart of the mine complex like a monstrous, skeletal god. It was here that Grady Voss had made his last stand, holding up with a handful of his most loyal and most desperate guards. From the high windows, their rifles cracked intermittently, keeping the victorious rebels at bay. The initial euphoria of the uprising gave way to the grim reality of a siege. Voss held the high ground, and his position was easily defensible. A direct assault would be a slaughter. Eli, Annabelle, and their lieutenants gathered behind the cover of a massive pile of timber to form a plan. "We can't rush him," Grizzly Jim stated, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "He'll pick us off like flies on a wall." "We could try to burn him out," Jesse Taggart suggested. "Give him a taste of what he was planning for the rest of us." "No," Eli said, his voice firm. "I want him alive. I want him to face a jury. I want him to stand in front of this whole town and answer for what he's done. We didn't start this fire to become a lynch mob." His gaze fell on Annabelle, a look of profound, fatherly pride in his eyes. He was not just fighting a battle. He was setting an example for the future lawwomen of Red Hollow. Annabelle, who had been studying the processing plant with a focused intensity, suddenly spoke. "There's a way in," she said, her voice clear and confident. "The conveyance tunnels. They use them to move the raw ore from the main shaft to the top of the crushers." The other men looked at her, then at the plant. They could see the large, enclosed wooden tunnels snaking their way up the side of the mountain and into the upper levels of the structure. "The main tunnel is probably guarded," she continued. "But there's an older one, a secondary shaft they stopped using last year because it was unstable. Sam, the delivery boy, showed it to me once. It comes up underneath the main sorting floor. They won't be expecting an attack from below." It was a risky, brilliant plan. Eli looked at his daughter, his heart swelling with a fierce pride. She was no longer just his child to be protected. She was a warrior, a strategist. "All right," he said. "Annabelle, you and I will take the Taggart brothers and go in through the tunnel. Grizzly, you keep up the suppressing fire. Make them think we're still planning a frontal assault. We go in 5 minutes." The journey through the abandoned tunnel was a tense, claustrophobic ordeal. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rot, and the timber supports groaned under the weight of the mountain above them. They moved in single file, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows, their every step echoing in the oppressive silence. They emerged through a trapdoor into the cavernous, deafening space of the sorting floor. The massive machinery was silent, but the room was a maze of hoppers, chutes, and conveyor belts. Above them, on a series of metal catwalks, they could hear the shouts of Voss and his men as they fired down at Grizzly's position. Using hand signals, Eli directed his small team. They split up, melting into the shadows of the machinery, climbing the iron ladders to the upper levels, moving with a deadly, coordinated silence. The hunters were inside the nest. The final battle was a series of vicious, close-quarters firefights on the narrow catwalks and platforms of the plant. The Taggart brothers, moving with the brutal efficiency of practiced killers, cleared the western catwalks, their Colts roaring in the enclosed space. Eli and Annabelle worked as a seamless team, covering each other, moving with an instinctual grace that spoke of a lifetime of shared trust. Annabelle, with her quick eyes and steady hand, was a deadly sharpshooter, picking off Voss's men from a distance. Eli, with his powerful shotgun, was an unstoppable force at close range, clearing platforms and stairwells with controlled, devastating blasts. The last of Voss's guards fell, and a sudden, Ringing silence descended, broken only by the distant crack of Grizzly's rifle and the creak of the building's timbers. Only Voss was left. They found him on the highest level, the control platform, a place that gave him a godlike view of his entire operation. He was not a cowering victim. He was a cornered, venomous snake. He had Hannibal's last, desperate message, one that had been intercepted, clutched in his hand, and he held a pistol to the head of the brave young courier, Sam, who he had caught and beaten. "Stay back," Voss screamed, his voice high and thin with panic and rage. "One more step, Sheriff, and the boy dies." "I should have known," he shrieked at Hannibal. "The clever little spy. I should have killed you the first night." Eli and Hannibal froze, their guns trained on him. They were in a standoff, the boy's life hanging in the balance. "It's over, Voss," Eli said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "There's nowhere left to run. Let the boy go." "It's over when I say it's over," Voss yelled, his eyes wild. He started to drag Sam backward, toward a large, open chute that dropped 3 stories to the massive iron crushers below. "I'll take you all to hell with me." But he had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated the girl. In his focus on the sheriff, he had momentarily turned his body, exposing a small sliver of his side from behind the boy's frame. It was all Hannibal needed. She didn't hesitate. She didn't aim for the head or the chest, shots that were too risky. She aimed for his gun hand. She fired a single, precise shot. The Remington barked. The bullet struck Voss's wrist, shattering the bone and sending his pistol clattering to the metal floor. He screamed, a sound of pure agony and shock, his hand instinctively clutching his ruined wrist. In that moment of distraction, Sam stomped down hard on Voss's instep and broke free, scrambling away. Voss was unarmed, wounded, and alone. He looked from the sheriff's implacable face to the cold, deadly fury in Hannibal's eyes. He saw no mercy. In a final, desperate act, he turned and lunged for their chute, choosing to leap into the darkness rather than face their justice. But Eli was faster. He didn't fire. He lunged forward and tackled Voss, a brutal, bone-jarring impact that sent both men crashing to the floor. The fight was over. The snake was caught. As Eli hauled the whimpering, defeated mine boss to his feet, Hannibal rushed to Sam, enveloping the terrified, bruised boy in a fierce hug. The battle was won. Justice, hard-won and bloody, had finally come to Red Hollow. The silence that fell over the processing plant was more profound than the preceding chaos. It was the silence of an engine that has finally seized, the silence of a fever that has broken. Below them, the sounds of shouting and sporadic gunfire had ceased, replaced by the victorious, joyful cries of the liberated miners. Eli Carter stood on the high platform, his hand clamped firmly on the arm of a weeping, defeated Grady Voss. Hannibal was kneeling, gently tending to the cuts and bruises on young Sam's face. The family, forged in law and tempered in battle, was whole again. The walk back down through the mine complex was a victory parade. As Eli emerged from the plant, shoving the captured mine boss ahead of him, a massive roar went up from the assembled crowd of miners and townsfolk. They swarmed forward, their faces a mixture of awe and ecstatic relief. They hoisted a stunned but beaming Sam onto their shoulders, cheering him as the hero he was. They clapped Eli on the back, shaking his hand, their respect for their old sheriff now bordering on reverence. But it was for Hannibal that their greatest admiration was reserved. The story of her captivity and her central role in the uprising had spread like wildfire. They saw the gunpowder on her face, the pistols on her hips, and the unyielding strength in her eyes, and they did not see a victim. They saw a warrior queen, their liberator. The women of the town rushed to her, embracing her, their tears a mixture of sympathy for her ordeal and pride in her incredible courage. The journey back to Red Hollow was a surreal procession. Eli, with the Taggart brothers at his side, led the captive Voss, his hands bound tightly behind his back. Hannibal walked beside her father, not as a rescued damsel, but as a fellow soldier returning from a hard-won campaign. Behind them trailed their small, victorious army and the liberated people of the mine, a river of humanity flowing back to reclaim their town. They put Voss in the one place he had thought he was immune to, the town jail. He was thrown into a cold, stone cell, the same cell that had held countless petty thieves and drunks. The master of the Goliath mine, the would-be king of Red Hollow, was now just another prisoner, stripped of his fine clothes and his power, left with nothing but his fear and his humiliation. The town did not descend into anarchy. The rage that had fueled the rebellion had been spent, replaced by a deep, communal desire to rebuild. Under Ellie's steady guidance, a provisional town council was formed, made up of honest ranchers and merchants. The corrupt officials, like Silas Croft, had been rounded up and were now occupying the cells next to their former boss. The trial of Grady Voss was held a week later, not in a secret back room, but in the open air of the town square. The entire population of Red Hollow served as the jury. The circuit judge, a stern but fair man who had heard rumors of the trouble and had ridden in with a pair of territorial marshals, presided. The testimony was damning. One by one, miners, ranchers, and shopkeepers stood up and spoke of Voss's crimes, the land grabs, the intimidation, the murder of Old Man O'Connell. The star witness, however, was Annabel Carter. She stood before the entire town, not in a dress, but in a simple riding skirt and a clean shirt, a pistol holstered on her hip. She did not speak with anger or seek pity. She spoke with a calm, chilling precision, detailing her abduction, her captivity, and the full extent of Voss's criminal conspiracy. She presented the documents she had seen, recalled the conversations she had overheard, and laid bare the rot that had nearly consumed their community. Her testimony was not just an accusation, it was a lesson in civic courage, a declaration that the people of Red Hollow would never again allow themselves to be silenced by fear. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Grady Voss and his co-conspirators were found guilty on all charges. The judge, seeing the raw emotion of the town, wisely decided against a local punishment. He sentenced them to be transported to the territorial prison to serve out life sentences of hard labor. As the marshals led a pale, shaking Voss away in chains, a new era for Red Hollow began. In the weeks that followed, a sense of profound change settled over the town. The Goliath mine was placed under the authority of the new town council, with the miners themselves forming a committee to ensure fair wages and safe working conditions. The land that Voss had stolen was returned to its rightful owners. The fear that had been a constant companion was gone, replaced by a sense of shared purpose and a fierce, protective pride in their community. Annabel, however, found that she could not go back. The life she had known before her ordeal was gone, burned away in the fire of the mansion and the crucible of the rebellion. She could no longer be content simply arranging flower displays for the church or teaching children their letters on a Sunday. She had seen the ugliness that lurked beneath the surface of the world, and she had discovered a strength within herself that she could not ignore. She found her father one evening on the porch of the sheriff's office, staring out at the sunset. He looked older, the lines on his face etched deeper, the weight of the star he wore seeming heavier than ever. "It's a lot to clean up," she said, standing beside him. "Justice always is," he replied, his voice weary. "It's easy to break things. It's the putting them back together that takes the real work." "I want to help," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to go back to the way things were, I can't. After what happened. I want to make sure it never happens to anyone else in this town ever again." Eli looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw and the clear, steady light in her gray eyes. He saw not a child, but a woman, a low woman. He had spent his life trying to protect her from the harsh realities of his world, and in the end, she had not only faced them but had triumphed over them. A slow, proud smile spread across his face. He unpinned a small, silver badge from his own vest. It wasn't the sheriff's star, but a simpler one, the star of a deputy. He held it out to her. "Then I guess," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that I'd be honored to have you as my partner." Annabel took the badge, its metal cool and heavy in her hand. It was more than a piece of tin. It was a promise, a calling, and the beginning of a new chapter in her life, and in the life of Red Hollow. The appointment of Annabel Carter as Red Hollow's first deputy sheriff was met with a mixture of surprise, skepticism, and overwhelming support. There were a few old-timers who grumbled into their whiskey that a woman's place wasn't behind a gun, but they were a small minority. Most of the town had witnessed her courage firsthand and saw the appointment as a fitting tribute to the woman who had become the symbol of their liberation. Annabel took to the role as if she had been born for it. She had her father's ironclad sense of right and wrong, but she brought a new dimension to the job. Where Eli was a blunt instrument of the law, a wall against which chaos broke. Annabelle was a skilled negotiator, a keen observer of human nature. She could de-escalate a tense saloon argument with a few quiet, well-chosen words, and she had an uncanny ability to uncover the truth of a matter, not just by looking at the evidence, but by listening to the stories people told. She and her father became a legendary team. They were a perfect balance of old-school grit and new-school intelligence. Eli taught her the finer points of tracking, of reading a crime scene, of surviving a gunfight. In turn, she taught him the importance of community policing, of building trust, of understanding that the law was not just about punishment, but about prevention. She started a youth program for the minors' children, teaching them to ride and shoot, but also instilling in them a respect for the law and for each other. She was not just keeping the peace, she was building a better future for the town she had almost died for. Her past had left its mark, however. There was a new hardness in her eyes, a watchfulness that never quite went away. She trusted slowly and was quick to see the potential for evil in the hearts of men. The scar of her ordeal was not a weakness, but a shield. It made her a more compassionate officer to the victims of crime, and a more formidable adversary to those who would perpetrate it. She had a special, unyielding intolerance for bullies and for those who abused their power. Grady Voss had inadvertently created his own worst nightmare, an incorruptible and deeply personal form of justice. Eli Carter watched his daughter's transformation with a quiet, profound pride. He saw the way she wore her star, the way she commanded respect, and he knew the future of Red Hollow was in safer hands than his own. He was getting older. The long years of wearing a gun and facing down death were taking their toll. His old wounds ached on cold mornings, and the weight of the star seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. He had spent his life as a guardian, and now he felt the deep, satisfying peace of knowing his charge was safe. The day he decided to retire came a year after the uprising. It was a quiet and remarkable Tuesday. They had just finished a long, dusty ride back from settling a dispute between two ranchers on the far side of the valley. As they dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, Eli paused, one hand on his saddle. "I'm tired, Annie," he said, using the childhood name he hadn't used in years. "My bones are tired. My soul is tired." Annabelle looked at him, her heart aching with a sudden, fierce love for this strong, wary man who had been her rock. "You've earned a rest, Pa," she said softly. He nodded, a slow, final kind of gesture. He walked into the office, took off his gun belt, and hung it on the peg on the wall. Then, he unpinned the sheriff's star from his chest, the star he had worn for 3 decades. He polished it slowly on his sleeve, his gaze distant, lost in the memories of a long and difficult life. He walked back out onto the porch where Annabelle was waiting. He held the star out to her. It glinted in the afternoon sun, a small, 6-pointed piece of history. "It's yours now," he said, his voice thick. "You've earned it more than I ever did. You didn't just uphold the law, Annie. You reminded this town what it stands for." Annabelle's eyes filled with tears as she took the star from his calloused hand. It was the passing of a torch, the end of an era, and the beginning of a new one. She pinned the star on her own vest, above the deputy's badge. It felt heavy, laden with the weight of her father's legacy and her own hard-won future. "I won't let you down, Pa," she whispered. "I know," he said, a proud, watery smile on his face. "You never have." He was true to his word. From that day on, Eli Carter was a private citizen. He bought a small plot of land just outside of town and spent his days gardening and woodworking, the simple, honest labor a balm for his weary soul. He was a constant, reassuring presence in the town, a living legend who was content to sit on the porch of the general store and offer quiet advice to the new sheriff when she asked for it. Annabelle Carter became one of the most respected lawwomen in the territory. Her story, and the story of Red Hollow's rebellion, became a cautionary tale for the ruthless industrialists and corrupt politicians who were trying to tame the West. It was a reminder that even in the dustiest, most forgotten corners of the frontier, the spirit of justice, when embodied by a brave and determined few, could be an unstoppable force. The sheriff's daughter had not just saved her town, she had become its enduring soul. The story of Annabelle Carter, the sheriff of Red Hollow, became a legend whispered around campfires and told in dime novels from San Francisco to St. Louis. She became a new kind of Western hero, not a lone, wandering gunslinger, but a woman of the law, rooted in her community, who fought not for vengeance or money, but for the simple, radical idea of a just and decent society. Red Hollow thrived under her protection. The Goliath mine, now run by a cooperative of the miners themselves, became a model of fair labor practices. The town grew, but it grew thoughtfully, with a new school, a small library funded by the sale of Voss's confiscated assets, and a community spirit that was the envy of the territory. The deep scar left by Grady Voss's reign of terror had healed into a bond of shared resilience. They were a town that had faced the darkness and had chosen the light, and Sheriff Annabelle Carter was the keeper of that flame. She never married. She would joke that the town was her only spouse, and the law her only child. She had suitors, of course, brave and decent men who admired her strength and beauty, but her heart bore a scar that never fully faded. She had given her trust once, to her father, and had seen that trust honored. But the world outside the circle of her duty remained a place where betrayal was possible, and she kept it at a safe distance. Her life was dedicated to ensuring that no other young woman would ever have to endure what she had endured. Her personal sacrifice was her gift to the future. Eli Carter lived to a ripe old age, a beloved patriarch of the town he had served for so long. He died peacefully in his sleep, a content man who had witnessed his legacy passed into the hands of the person he loved most in the world. The entire town turned out for his funeral, a solemn, heartfelt tribute to the man who had been their unshakable moral compass. Annabelle, standing tall and proud in her sheriff's uniform, delivered the eulogy, her voice never breaking, her words a testament to a father who had taught his daughter not only how to shoot a gun, but how to stand for what is right, no matter the cost. And what of the legend? It grew with each passing year. They said that on quiet nights, you could still hear the ghosts of the rebellion in the wind that swept down from the mountains. They said that the light in the sheriff's office window, where Annabelle often worked late into the night, was a beacon of hope that could be seen for miles. The final chapter of her story, the one that cemented her place in the mythology of the West, came many years later. A new railroad baron, a man with the same cold, greedy eyes as Grady Voss, came to the valley with plans to seize land and divert the river, threatening to undo all the progress Red Hollow had made. He requested a meeting with the town's famous female sheriff, intending to bribe or intimidate her, as he had done in a dozen other towns. He was shown into her office. She was no longer a young woman, but a formidable figure in her middle years, her red hair streaked with gray, her face lined with wisdom and authority, her gray eyes as clear and steady as ever. The railroad baron made his offers, his threats veiled in polite language. Annabelle listened patiently, her hands clasped on her desk. When he was finished, she simply smiled, a cold, knowing expression that made the powerful man deeply uncomfortable. She stood up and walked to the wall behind her desk. On it hung two items, framed and preserved behind glass. One was the simple, tin star of a deputy. The other was a tattered, yellowed piece of paper. It was the fraudulent labor contract that had once condemned her to slavery. Many years ago, Sheriff Carter said, her voice quiet but ringing with the strength of forged steel, a man came to this town who thought he could buy it. He thought he could buy our land, he thought he could buy our law, and he thought he could buy me. She tapped the glass over the contract. He learned that in Red Hollow, some things are not for sale. I suggest you learn that lesson much more quickly, and much less painfully, than he did. The railroad baron, they say, left her office a pale and shaken man. He packed his bags and his plans and was gone from the valley by morning. He had looked into the eyes of a legend, and he had seen that the stories were true. Annabelle Carter served as the sheriff of Red Hollow for 40 years, a steadfast guardian of the legacy she and her father had forged in fire and blood. She retired a beloved, revered figure, leaving the town in the hands of a new generation that she herself had trained. She had taken a story of personal tragedy and transformed it into a legacy of justice, proving that the heart of the West was not in its veins of gold, but in the unbreakable spirit of the people who dared to call it home.